Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Food Fight, From Plunder and Profit to People and Planet, by Stuart Gillespie. Narrated by Stuart Gillespie.
Introduction. Food is life, but our food system is killing us. Designed in a different century for a different purpose, to mass-produce cheap calories to prevent famine. It's now generating obesity, ill health, and premature death. We need to transform it into one that can nourish all 8 billion of us and the planet we live on. Right now, we're enmeshed in a cascade of overlapping crises. Obesity, undernutrition, and the climate crisis are, in and of themselves, huge challenges. Things are made worse by the fact that they overlap, they interact, and they share basic causes. And when COVID came along, a pandemic was added to the mix. Our current food system, which sits smack centre of the cascade, is no longer fit for purpose. It's a system that's now destroying more than it produces. Levels of hunger and undernutrition are rising again, while 1 in 2 adults are overweight or living with obesity. The double burden of malnutrition affects most countries in the world now. By 2035, it will cost the global economy as much as COVID at its peak, but this cost will be borne year on year every year. We're a species supremely adapted to forage, hunt, to find and consume food. Feasting in times of plenty allowed us to survive the more frequent times of want, a strategy dictated by the environment we lived in. But our food environment has changed in an evolutionary nanosecond. Most of us now rely on a diet of ultra-processed product. It's not real food. Our bodies and metabolic systems can't handle it. We're in a dangerous place, like dolphins in a desert. What used to be an advantage is now a liability. Transnational mega companies have harnessed the biology of desire and used it to get us addicted to products that make them rich and us sick. A quarter of all adult deaths, over 12 million every year, are due to poor diets. And it's still the poorest, the most marginalized, who are most likely to become malnourished, get sick, and die too soon. Like health, food lacks a specific, measurable dimension, because it is and it means so many things to us. Food is essential for our survival, though some makes us ill and can even kill us. It's a basic need, a source of pleasure, an object of desire, more fundamental than sex, but it can also generate stress, shame, and fear. Food is identity, culture, celebration, a source of joy, friendship, and love. Food brings people together. It can be a peace offering. But it can also be a source of conflict, even a weapon of war. Food is political, ethical, moral, a human right, and it's also an economic commodity with a price tag. Through land, water, and agriculture, food connects us with nature, animals, and the environment. It works on many levels, at many scales, from the way that nutrients affect our gut microbiome, our metabolism, even our mood, to the way food is provisioned and allocated within households and communities. Food is both a national concern and one of the most basic commodities in global trade and international cooperation. Food systems encompass all steps from farm to fork, field to plate, seed to feed. The full chain of activities, the forces at play, the institutions and people involved, the outcomes and the web of connections between all these elements. Many food systems are small-scale and local, but there is one dominant global system that profits from products and practices that are not good for us. The problem we face now is a simple fact that our global food system is an anachronism. In the last century, it has performed miracles, but in this one it's a source of jeopardy. Over time it's become sclerotic, and it's now making us ill and destroying our planet. We should not speak of reform and repair because it's not actually broken. The system we have is working just the way those who control it want it to work. For capitalism to sustain itself, it needs to generate profit, and in 2025, after nearly 50 years of neoliberalism, the most profitable food system is the one that manufactures ultra-processed products which are marketed aggressively across the world. We have become hostages to this system. But things are changing. People are educating themselves. We're increasingly fed up with the box of tricks that multinationals use to bamboozle us. Not just disillusioned, but angry, especially with governments that fail to act in our interests. We know enough now. It's time to harness this knowledge and power to drive the change that's needed. In Food Fight, we go on a journey through time and place and across sectors and disciplines. The first part, Cascade, offers a snapshot of the food, nutrition and health situation in the world now. We look at the challenges we face, their manifestations, causes and consequences. In the second part, Regime, we revisit the 3 food regimes that have most impacted how our food systems are structured today. Regimes are launched and sustained by power. Without learning from the past, we end up repeating it. In the 3 chapters in this section, we travel through 3 centuries of colonialism, followed by 3 decades of Cold War, and the last half-century of the neoliberal corporate regime in which our current food system is embedded. The third part, Unraveling, is where we disentangle the structural drivers of the cascade and explore how they operate. We will see how the cascade involves vicious cycles in which the feedback amplifies or accelerates the effect. We will learn how the global food system has itself become a large part of the problem, having been captured by transnational corporations who profit from public ill health while using an array of tactics to stop government from getting in their way. We look at the environmental implications of this system and the way it thrives on inequalities and health shocks, including pandemics like AIDS and COVID. These structural causes derive from our collective failure to rein in harmful industries, address food injustice, and hold our elected leaders to account for their actions or inaction. We unpack the different forms of power and the way they are used, because, ultimately, to transform our food system, we need to make a radical shift in the balance of power. The fourth part, Transformation, shows how we can do this. We explore the roles of governments, civil society, citizens, researchers, journalists and company executives in transforming our food system into one that will see us through the rest of this century and beyond. We see how vicious cycles can be turned into virtuous cycles, how we can turn their connectivity into a positive multiplier, from adversity to advantage. The word crisis, after all, comes from the Greek word which means a separation, a turning point. This is where we are right now. Food Fight shows how we got to this point and how, through a new set of collective and individual actions, we can drive a food revolution. As we move into the second quarter of the 21st century, it's clear we have enough evidence, experience and power. We can do it together. We can create a better future for ourselves and our children, especially our children. Part 1. Cascade. Chapter 1. Overfed, undernourished. In the late 70s, I became interested in nutrition because I wanted to understand why some people became malnourished and others didn't. Being malnourished meant being undernourished, being hungry. Obesity wasn't on the public health radar then. 20 years later, I led an initiative on the emergence of a double burden of malnutrition, the coexistence of undernutrition with overweight and obesity. At the time it seemed more threat than reality. I was still focused on undernutrition because it was an outcome of deprivation. Until we started to look at the data, I thought obesity was a very different problem, down to individuals making bad choices. I was so wrong. Through the first quarter of this century, obesity has skyrocketed in many countries of the world, in urban and rural areas, among both children and adults. 4 out of 10 adults, 2.5 billion, are now overweight or living with obesity. In the UK, it's closer to 7 in 10. Our team was trying to characterise the double burden at a population level, but over the years it became clear that it could exist in communities and even in households, stunted kids with overweight parents. This was more, not less, likely to happen in the poorest households in the poorest communities. Later still, we realised it was happening in the same individual, A stunted child would grow into a stunted adult who was then at greater risk of becoming overweight in an environment flooded by junk food. The next big discovery was that the causes of undernutrition and overnutrition were similar. They weren't separate conditions, but they overlapped in space and time, and they shared drivers that derived from disrupted infant feeding and care and from dysfunctional food systems. We need to return to a holistic focus on malnutrition, poor nutrition. In 2025, malnutrition in all its forms is by far the biggest cause of ill health on this planet, affecting 1 in 3 people. Every country is affected. The UK double burden is world-beating. Hundreds of thousands of children in the 6th richest country in the world are simultaneously overweight and undernourished. Preschool children in the UK are shorter than their peers in nearly all other high-income countries. For instance, 5-year-old boys and girls are 7 centimetres shorter than their Dutch counterparts. In 1985, British boys and girls ranked 69th of 200 nationalities for height. Boys are now 102nd and girls 96th. Diet is the main driver of anthropometric outcomes: height, weight, growth, but it is not the only one. Many structural factors related to poverty, injustice, and environmental disadvantage interact in their effects on nutrition and health. A child's height can be affected by illness, infection, stress, sleep quality, housing and living conditions, as well as diet. Differences in the heights of young children between socioeconomic groups capture the effects of poverty and inequality. Data on the height of 19-year-olds in the UK who grew up during the last 14 years of Tory-led austerity suggest economic factors contributed to the faltering growth of British children. We've become so focused on rising obesity that failing growth has slipped below the radar. A healthy diet is crucial for a sustained supply of the nutrients needed for growth, physical and cognitive development, and essential to avoid both undernutrition and obesity. In December 2023, The Guardian's lead front-page article spelled out the growing crisis. More than 800,000 patients had been admitted to hospital with nutritional deficiencies in 2022 to 2023, a threefold increase on 10 years earlier. Professor Camilla Hawthorne, chair of the Royal College of GPs, said doctors were facing moral distress because they couldn't help. It's not like you can prescribe money or food. Jan Jemson of Magic Breakfast, a charity providing free breakfasts to school children facing hunger, spoke of children with teeth falling out with bowed legs. GPs in poorer areas reported a resurgence of Victorian-era diseases such as rickets and scurvy caused by nutritional deficiencies. The highest rate of child undernutrition was found in Norfolk and Waveney, where 1 in 12 children were undernourished. The big irony here is that Norfolk is the breadbasket of the country and grows nearly a third of all edible crops and almost half of homegrown vegetables. Meanwhile, obesity-related admissions to hospital have doubled in just 6 years. In the UK, 1 in 3 children are overweight or living with obesity. By age 10 to 11, 1 in 4 boys and 1 in 5 girls have obesity. 30% of all children in the most deprived areas, compared with 13% in the least deprived. Malnutrition is a global crisis. Undernutrition in the form of stunting, wasting or micronutrient deficiencies affects hundreds of millions worldwide, increasing ill health and death, especially among young children and women, and generates a raft of consequences that play out at all levels, from individual to national. Stunting, low height for age, is a result of poor nutrition in utero and in early childhood. Around a quarter of all children under 5 years old on the planet, 148 million, are affected, nearly all of whom live in Asia and Africa. Wasting, low weight for height, a manifestation of acute growth failure caused by illness, affects 45 million under 5s. And then there are various deficiencies of micronutrients, essential vitamins and minerals, which afflict 2 billion people worldwide. More than 1.5 billion people are deficient in iron. In Africa and Southeast Asia, 2/3 of all preschoolers and half of all pregnant women are anemic. Vitamin A deficiency affects 250 million preschool children, blinding up to 500,000 of them, half of whom will die shortly after losing their vision. A similar number of children are deficient in iodine, significantly impairing their cognitive development. Some progress has been made in reducing stunting in children and underweight in women, and in tackling iodine deficiency. Anemia in children and women and low birth weight rates, however, have not changed for decades. Turning to the other side of the double burden, obesity is now a global pandemic, affecting more than 1 billion people. The United States led the way. Obesity among American adults nearly tripled in 4 decades, from 15% in 1980 to 42% in 2020. In the UK, adult obesity has tripled in the last 50 years. 1/3 of all British adults now live with obesity, the highest proportion in Europe besides Malta and Turkey. Another third are overweight. Looking ahead, the World Obesity Federation predicts more than half the world's population, over 4 billion people, will be living with overweight or obesity by 2035, if current trends prevail, half of whom will have obesity. Childhood obesity could more than double by 2035, in just 15 years from 2020 levels, affecting 208 million boys and 175 million girls. Of the 10 countries with the greatest expected increases, 9 are in Asia or Africa. Between 2006 and 2021 in India, for example, underweight among women halved, 35% to 18%, as overweight doubled, 12% to 24%, and it was a similar picture among men. The percentage of overweight or obesity among preschool children in India has now exceeded the percentage of undernourished children. This is not a sudden onset disaster like a tsunami. The double burden is an unremitting landslide that's sweeping the globe. The good news is there is a lot we can do to turn things around, as we'll explore later. But first we need to dig deeper and to better understand what's going on and why. The life cycle of malnutrition. I first explored the life cycle dynamics of malnutrition in the mid-90s while developing a learning package for UNICEF staff. At that time, the focus was on undernutrition. The evidence was clear. If a mother is undernourished in pregnancy and her diet is poor, fetal growth and development will be compromised and the child will be more likely to have a low birth weight. Effectively born undernourished, the newborn will have a greater risk of dying in infancy, and if he or she survives, of acquiring developmental and health problems throughout childhood and into adult life. Any significant growth failure in this period will have irreversible consequences in later life. Stunted children become stunted adolescents who have difficulties in completing their education and finding a decent job. This cycle is amplified among women who marry early, do not complete secondary education, and are from poorer households. Up to 1/3 of child stunting at age 5 is due to this cycle. Undernutrition is thus not only one of the key manifestations of poverty, but also one of its key drivers in the future, both in adulthood and the next generation. Vicious cycles again. Micronutrient malnutrition also travels through generations. A lack of essential vitamins and minerals can be devastating for a pregnant woman and her unborn child. The micronutrient deficient mother is more likely to have complications in pregnancy and more likely to die giving birth. Iron deficiency anemia causes 1 in 4 maternal deaths around the world. Her baby is more likely to be born prematurely, have low birth weight, suffer from congenital defects, be cognitively impaired by poor brain growth in the womb, and more likely to fail to develop and grow well in infancy. Epigenetics and mismatched environments. In 1998, I met Professor David Barker of the University of Southampton. We were both in New York working for UNICEF. Like many, I was intrigued and a bit disturbed by the groundbreaking Barker hypothesis. Barker was an epidemiologist who in 1990 floated the notion that children born with low birth weight had higher risks of developing chronic diseases such as hypertension, coronary heart disease and diabetes in middle age. Since then, a wealth of literature has been generated on how early life undernutrition within the womb and the first year of life reduces the capacity of developing organs to cope with stress. The result is a higher risk of cardiovascular and metabolic ill health later in life. Historical studies of individuals who were in utero during the Dutch hunger winter 1944-45, caused by the German blockade, confirmed an association between undernutrition in the womb and development of obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes later in life. Babies in the womb during this famine were 30% more likely to develop obesity in adulthood than other babies. Questions were in fact being asked a lot earlier. In the early 70s, as a medical student in India, Chittaranjan Yashnik was bewildered by some of the diabetes patients at his hospital in Pune, India. They didn't look like type 2 diabetics. They didn't have obesity, they weren't old, they looked normal, some even quite thin. 20 years later, he set up a cohort of mothers and their babies in 6 rural villages near Pune. The babies were small and thin, but they had high levels of adiposity, especially around their waist, a predisposition to diabetes that they'd inherited at birth from their mothers, whose diets during pregnancy were not nutritious. The thin, fat baby represents a mismatch of environments in rapid flux. As B. Wilson eloquently put it, the story of the nutrition transition written on human bodies. Epigenetics shows how where we live and what we do, our environment and our behavior, can affect the way our genes work, whether a gene is expressed or not, which in turn can affect the health of our future children. If a woman is undernourished during pregnancy, her body sends signals to the fetus that the world is one in which it's hard to get enough calories. This triggers an adaptive response in the growing embryo, in which the body stores more energy per calorie consumed in preparation for this harsh outside world of scarcity. In genetic terms, these babies have phenotypes for hunger. The problem arises when they are born into a rapidly changing world in which calories are no longer scarce, but rather flood the place in the form of cheap, energy-dense junk food. What was an adaptation is now a liability. This metabolic imprinting makes it much more likely the child will develop obesity and chronic disease in later life. Undernutrition in one generation causes overnutrition in the next one. We used to speak of the life cycle of malnutrition, but in reality there are many cycles that spin around generation after generation, each one influenced by the one before it. Nutritional disadvantage driven by inequitable factors and processes can last for decades. This is a big deal, but it also gives us hope. Epigenetics is bad when the environment is bad, but it also means we can turn things around, from adversity to advantage, by protecting the nutrition and health status of women and by improving food environments. Today, the more common situation is that of a mother being overweight during pregnancy. In the global north, more than half of all pregnancies are now in women who are overweight or living with obesity. A third of these are also complicated by diabetes. Maternal obesity compromises the development of the unborn child's cardiovascular and central nervous systems, increases the risk of health problems at birth and beyond. Children born to mothers who have obesity during pregnancy are more likely to be born with a high or low birth weight and/or increased adiposity, either way putting them at greater risk of obesity later in life. If the expectant mother is hypertensive, babies may have low birth weight because of altered blood and therefore nutrient flow to the fetus. Rapid catch-up growth of a low birth weight baby can amplify the effect of poor growth in the womb on the risk of metabolic and cardiovascular diseases later in life. And a child who then develops obesity is 5 times more likely than healthy weight peers to experience it as an adult. In essence, the period that extends from conception through 9 months of pregnancy in the first 2 years of a child's life is critical for both child and mother. 1,000 days, a period of vulnerability, but also a golden window of opportunity when the greatest lifelong benefits can be set in motion. Chapter 2. Damage. Everybody, sooner or later, sits down to a banquet of consequences. Robert Louis Stevenson. For 2 years in the mid-80s, I was a nutrition volunteer on a rural development project with Koya tribal communities in a teak forest in southern India. Child undernutrition was a big problem throughout the year, but especially in the rainy season. My job was to work with an inner circle of health worker trainers to deliver a range of nutrition and health services to 25 hamlets. To help us all figure what was happening, we set up a surveillance system that involved monitoring the growth of the youngest children. The first 2 years of life are crucial, as this is when they need the most care and when they're supposed to grow fastest. Mothers did what they could, but they could barely cope. Everything went into overdrive during the monsoon, when armies of tribal women would work bent double, dawn till dusk, transplanting rice saplings from the nursery beds into the main fields. This was also the time when diarrheal and respiratory disease peaked, when food stocks were lowest and the roads to clinics were impassable. When their parents were in the fields, kids were left at home with siblings or grandparents. Infants would not be breastfed, or they'd be weaned abruptly onto formula feed, which was often prepared with contaminated water. Many got sick, some died. Around this time, David Seckler, an American economist, thought he had a solution to India's malnutrition problem. He proposed waving a statistical wand to declare millions of stunted children to be perfectly fine. They might be small, but that didn't mean they weren't healthy. He speculated that short stature was an adaptation to environmental stress. This was a small but healthy hypothesis. A smaller child has lower nutrient requirements and can therefore survive on less food. This gives them a better chance of survival. His article in the Economic and Political Weekly, EPW, infuriated me. Things looked very different in the forest. Stunting was not a slow incremental process of disease-free slowing of growth. It was savage. Some kids managed to catch up some of their lost growth later, but then they get hit again. A brutal roller coaster. This wasn't adaptation. It was a desperate struggle. If they survived, they'd become small adults. We did not know then what the long-term implications were for their brain development, their employability, their future. That evidence came later. I was blown away by the arrogance of economists who thought they had the answer to the world's nutrition problems. 3 decades later, in 2013, Arvind Panagarya, a leading Indian economist, became convinced, like Seckler, that the nutritional status of Indian children should not be judged using international reference standards. This despite the fact that Indian children were among a pool of children used to define the standards. He believed that Indian children, and presumably adults, were genetically different to children from any other country. This time an entire issue of EPW had been devoted to the debate. I wrote a rebuttal, Myths and Realities, as did others, including Jean Drèze and Angus Deaton, who had just won the Nobel Prize for Economics. A few weeks later, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi appointed Panagarya as head of the Planning Commission, the leading civil servant post in the country. The problem is not being small, it's becoming small. The process of growth failure is bad for the child in the present, illness, lack of psychosocial care, etc., and it has long-term costs. Adults who fail to grow well during childhood are disadvantaged in manual work that requires strength. Much more damaging than that are the long-term implications for cognitive development, which in turn affects learning in school, employability, and their future lives. The consequences of malnutrition are massive and pervasive, but they're also often hidden. The bulk of the iceberg is below the waterline. 4 types of damage relating to survival, health, social and economic effects are key. Survival and health. Malnutrition kills millions and erodes the potential of billions. It is by far the biggest cause of ill health and premature death globally, contributing as much disease burden as the next 2 to 3 leading categories combined: hypertension, tobacco, high glucose. 1/4 of all adult deaths each year, more than 12 million, are due to poor diets and malnutrition. Undernutrition causes 45% of all deaths of children under 5 years of age in low and middle income countries. These deaths are preventable. malnutrition stunts growth and impairs development. These children may never attain their full possible height, and their brains may never fully develop.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?